Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. You want to hear something astounding? How about the eminent Harvard psychiatrist who came to believe that aliens from outer space abducted humans? The psychiatrist was John Mack. He was also a renowned social reformer and a Pulitzer Prize winner for his biography of Lawrence of Arabia. The many passions of John Mack are revealed in this provocative new biography, The Believer. Distinguished author Ralph Blumenthal is with us next. Ralph Blumenthal, good to see you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony. Great to be here.
For those of you who don't know Ralph, I should mention his distinguished 45-year career at the New York Times. He is currently a distinguished lecturer at Baruch College, and The Believer is his seventh book. You quote, Ralph, you quote John Mack in the book as saying, it's very hard to take a German Jewish materialist and turn him into a mystic. Um, let's start with the German Jewish materialist. Who was John Mack?
Okay, John Mack was a Harvard psychiatrist, esteemed member of the medical establishment at Harvard, who got interested in the phenomenon of alien abduction, human beings who had very searing memories of being or encountering aliens, shall we say, going up to their spaceships and having experiments performed on them, including reproductive procedures to produce a hybrid race. So that's what he got interested in. And, the question in my book is really what got him going from a member of the Harvard establishment, the esteemed psychiatrist, to a career that subjected him to some ridicule.
This guy was a man of many, many passions, as you point out.
Yes, indeed. And that's what made it so interesting. I mean, he was no, ordinary ufologist who got gripped by this, strange phenomenon. He had a very eminent career, as you say, as a social reformer. He brought mental health services to Cambridge when that was a downtrodden part of Boston. He saw Lawrence of Arabia, as we all did at that time. We walked away from the theater and said, wow, that was a long movie. But he decided he was going to do a psychological biography of Lawrence, and he spent 12 years in England and the Middle East researching it. And that made him a Middle East expert, and he started working on peace efforts in the Middle East. He met with Yasser Arafat. Then he protested, as you said, nuclear weapons in Nevada. As a physician, he was very much against, nuclear war. And, little by little, I mean, he was very well grounded, no pun intended, in, causes on this earth. And then through a series of, happenstance experiences, he became interested in this other world, the spiritual world, which remains a mystery.
Let's get into that question you raised a little while ago. How does this happen? And I mean, it's almost 300-page book we find out, but how can you give us a thumbnail version?
To summarize it, you're right. It's hard to summarize. He went out to Esalen, that psychic think tank on the Pacific, and he got involved in something called holotropic breathing, changing his level of consciousness through breathing discipline. And he found he accessed what might be a previous life. He was propelled back to his childhood when he lost his mother at age 8.5 months. So he had all these strange experiences. And he said that opened up his psyche, and the UFOs flew in. The UFOs flew in because someone gave him an introduction to an artist named Bud Hopkins, who was investigating UFOs and alien experiences. And John Mack went to see him and saw a bunch of letters that people had written Bud Hopkins, and Mack was himself enthralled because he thought he knew the human psyche, and here was an aspect that he knew nothing about. These encounters that people felt so strongly about that they actually wept and screamed, recreating them. So John Mack thought, well, these sound authentic. And eventually he realized these people are not mentally ill. I mean, that was his field. He was a psychiatrist. So he knew when he saw insanity, they were not mentally ill. They were not fabricating. They were not deluded. They were not hoaxing him by and large. I mean, there were always cases of, some people making stuff up. But he came away with the conclusion that something real had happened to these people.
Not nightmares either, because one of the other aspects of his background is he had written a book as a psychiatrist about nightmares. He had studied nightmares, so that he came to. Can we say he came to? We know he came to believe the people. Can we say he came to believe that what they said, what they recounted, actually happened?
Initially, he did. As a matter of fact, too much for Harvard's taste. He basically conveyed the impression that he believed that these things were happening in some kind of reality. And, that did get him into trouble with Harvard eventually. So in the beginning, yes, he did believe that. But increasingly, he came to believe, unlike Bud Hopkins, from whom he got the concept originally, he came to believe that this was happening on some spiritual plane we don't understand. It's another dimension, another reality that penetrates ours in a very immediate way, sometimes a mysterious way. And it was linked, he thought, later in his life to all kinds of other paranormal experiences, including crop circles and Bigfoot and the Holy Grail legend and life after death. He really widened his scope to take in a lot of other, paranormal events. But in the beginning, he was struck by their stories and thought, "Yep, this is really happening."
One of the subtitles of your book is Hard Science, and you make a lot of the fact of what you were just saying, that his methods in studying these people, he convened a group of his own. So I guess they're called experiencers, but people who claim to have been abducted. And he was very meticulous in his study of these people.
Yes, he was. And I do spend some time in the book talking about the science, because I don't want it to come across as a science fiction or fantasy work. I actually start off the book with a story of a conference at MIT in 1992 that brought together John Mack and a group of atomic physicists, other psychologists, psychiatrists, folklorists, theologians, all seeking to grapple with this experience that they all agreed had some validity. It was not made up. It was not figments of imagination. So these eminent professionals gathered at MIT, which didn't sponsor the conference. MIT just gave them a venue. But anyway, and the transcript of that conference came out later, and it does deal with science and the efforts to pin down this phenomenon. How successful they were, I sort of tell in my book. And as I say, no spoiler here, it ends up a mystery, but a mystery that rules out certain things that so-called skeptics say immediately when you ask them about this. Oh, these people are crazy, or these people are mentally ill, or they're fabricating, or they're deluded. So at least I say we can eliminate certain things.
You quote him on the subject many times in the book, but a couple stood out for me. That Mack saying some sort of intelligence, this is a quote, some sort of intelligence seems to have entered our world. And what in fact it's about is a different question from, whether in fact what these people are saying rings true.
Yeah, he felt that the universe was a place of consciousness, that there was intelligence that was non-human. This intelligence takes the form of these beings, whatever. Certainly, there's something in the universe beyond, the brain, and human consciousness, goes beyond the brain, and world and universal consciousness goes beyond the human brain.
Give us, Ralph, if you can, an idea or summary, perhaps, some of the stories these people told him.
Wow. John Mack wrote a book called Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens, that got him into further trouble with Harvard because, first of all, it was a bestseller and no academic likes
Well,
to
he wrote two, in fact. They're
see
both,
too.
both
And
bestsellers, I think.
absolutely. But the first one was the one that created the real, earthquake. It sold very well. It was 13 case studies of people he had interviewed at great length. And again, he was a psychiatrist, as you said. He had studied human nightmares. He wrote a book about it. He studied childhood development. So he knew a lot of what he's talking about. So when people say, oh, these people are just having nightmares, he knew that that was not true. A nightmare was different. Plus, it wasn't always happening at night. People were having these experiences driving in their car, walking on the street. In one case, a woman driving a snowmobile. So the idea that this only happened at night or that it was sleep apnea, some sleep disturbance, it did not comport with the facts. So the stories people told were basically consistent, but there were many variations. But the so-called core narrative was that someone would be in their bed at night or driving a car, become aware of a UFO, feel something strange, lose track of time, and arrive at their destination, if they were driving, let's say, a few hours later with no memory, conscious memory of what had happened. If they were in their bedroom, they become aware of beings in the bedroom. They might feel themselves beamed through walls and windows to some kind of a ship where they would be put on a table, some furniture, subjected to various pseudo-medical tests that really don't have a counterpart on Earth because earthly doctors don't take people's eyes out and then put them back in, as far as we know, things like that. Women felt that they had their eggs removed, and men felt that they were forced to contribute sperm. Later on, many said that they were re-abducted or felt that they were re-abducted to see their hybrid children, which were mixtures of human and alien, physiognomy. And then they were returned to their beds. Their partners were switched off. No other witnesses could see this, by and large. So that's the core story. But there were so many other things that didn't quite fit. Everybody had a little variation. So it was not some consistent story that was making the rounds that everybody was subscribing to. So there were extremely odd variations that struck Mack. And actually, some researchers said, what you really have to study are the things that don't fit, because that's what's really interesting. And who are the people who are not abducted? Why aren't they abducted? So that was one of the many mysteries.
You mentioned, of course, the publication of the book being a bestseller and the earthquake, as you put it, that it caused at Harvard and everywhere else. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, they were scandalized.
I mean, Harvard, as I point out in the book, was no stranger to paranormal research. William James, the paterfamilias of psychology, was dealing with seances, 100 years ago at Harvard and lectured about it. But what Harvard objected to, Harvard Medical School superiors objected to, was Mack's approach. He was very enthusiastic, which he acknowledged. He was naive at times, thinking that he could do all this and not attract, the kind of attention he would at Harvard. But eventually Harvard convened a committee, and they said it was not an inquisition. So of course, it made Mack think immediately, well, if they were saying that it was not an inquisition, why would they say what it wasn't? And I really refer to it often in my discussions as a kind of an inquisition. It was secret. It was an inquiry into his methods, into his billing methods, into how he treated his patients or subjects that could never figure out what they were. And it was very intrusive. They interviewed Mack many times. They interviewed many of Mack's colleagues, many of whom were dismissive, some of whom were supportive. They interviewed experiencers themselves, so they had a full taste of what these people were saying. But in the end, they could not wrap their heads around, I'm talking about the committee, they could not wrap their heads around the fact that if you couldn't see it, taste it, and touch it, it could still exist. Mac was
I laugh and a moment ago because of just the way presumably sophisticated outfit like Harvard would position this, not an inquisition. Really, it makes me think of Monty Python or something like that.
Well, there were some comic aspects of this. And by the way, John, he first showed up for his committee meetings, very collegially. He thought, I'll just talk to my colleagues. And his nephew at Harvard, also a physician, said, you have got to be out of your mind going in there without representation. You're trying to channel, Lawrence of Arabia. You're trying to be the martyr that he was. So Mack finally got himself great legal representation. He got Danny Mack, who had investigated the Ku Klux Klan and Iran-Contra. He was a Jesuit, hotshot Jesuit lawyer. Firebrand, he got Eric McLeish, who had basically exposed the priest abuse scandal in Boston. It was a factor in the Spotlight movie with the Boston Globe. So he had great legal representation. And basically at the end, they said, well, don't be so enthusiastic. And he said, okay, I won't.
They basically buried the thing. They did.
Well, that's right. The inquiry was never, it was secret and it was never reported on fully. I pulled the pieces together in my book based on Mack's own personal records and his legal memos and things like that, but Harvard never issued a full report on the episode.
What they, as you alluded to a moment ago, what they wanted was proof. There is no proof, but that's not a reason for assuming it didn't happen.
Right. It was really what Mack said in an unpublished manuscript, when worldviews collide. And the committee was very focused on materialism and said, you've got to provide proof of this. And Mack said, well, he had fragmentary proof. I mean, some of these people coming away from their abduction experiences had unexplained scars. There were some witness accounts. There were anomalies in the areas where UFOs were seen landing. So there was a basic consistency to the accounts that Mack found proof worthy. And most important, perhaps, some of the accounts were from children as young as 2 years old, who said, little man, come fly me to the sky. And, little children were not reading books about abduction. They weren't going to the movies and learning about abduction. They were telling what presumably they thought had happened to them. So pulling all these stuff together, Mack said, yes, there is proof. I can't show you an ashtray from a UFO, but there are reasons to believe these stories are not just figments of imagination. There is some reason to believe they're penetrating the reality.
Of course, in addition to the earthquake at Harvard, this was, if we could call it that, an earthquake as far as the media concerned. They were all over this. Mack and Oprah, he was, there were 60 Minutes, there were Time Magazine. I mean, he was everywhere, and this story was everywhere.
He was, and I was reminded of his appearance on Oprah when I saw Oprah's, program with Meghan and Harry. She had Mack, she had experiences on the air, and it was kind of a circus, because whenever you try to take this to, a TV show like Oprah, it becomes, it takes it away from the scientific, really. It was not a good forum to discuss these very subtle and often, sexual, episodes. So it was not a great experience for him.
Ralph, let's talk a little further about that childhood trauma of his, losing his mother when he was an infant, and what role that may have played in this pursuit and some of his others in John Mack's life.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do devote quite some attention to it in the book. His mother died of appendicitis when he was 8.5 months old, so it was a huge trauma for him. It would be for any child. He had felt his mother had been taken away from him. He was, such a baby. He didn't understand why. His father, who was a professor at City College when I went to City College, incidentally, English professor, he remarried fairly quickly to a woman with her own very tragic story. But anyway, so John had a stepmother and he had a stepsister, and it really affected his growing up. He was always, and this is not me talking, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but people close to him and members of his family and closest friends said he was always searching for something missing in his life, the ineffable. And I think it's interesting that that would play a part in his search for, consciousness in the cosmos or other intelligence. He really was searching. He found other women in addition to his wife, which didn't make her happy, and he made no really bones about it. He said, "I'm attracted to other women." But he also was searching for something that would validate that he was no longer alone. So it did play a big part in his life.
You quote him, Ralph, at one point as saying, "I was always interested in sources of suffering." And he makes the point, and you, of course, report the point in the book, that these people who reported these incidents, these experiences, were suffering.
They were suffering, and but John differed from some other abduction researchers like Bud Hopkins and David Jacobs in saying that their experience was not only traumatic. He found they came away with a greater appreciation of the problems on Earth, particularly pollution. They came away with a close identification with the deity or God or some source of goodness in the universe. So it did change their outlook. Other researchers said, no, the aliens were basically, evil, and they traumatized people with their experiments, and they were taking our DNA for a hybrid race, or, who knows what. But John thought it was a transformative experience, and that's what made him differ from many of the others.
Yeah, the suffering, I'm glad you point all that out. The suffering I was referring to is what you point out in the book, and Mac obviously was aware that having had these experiences, these people are lost in a sense, because they feel there's nobody we can tell this to. They'll think we're nuts.
Well, they feel differently that they're different from other people. One woman said, and I quote her in the book, I go to my PTA meetings and I stop at Shop and Stop. So anyone looking at me thinks I'm completely normal, but I've had these, and she was normal. And that's the thing about these people. They were all normal. They were not crazy. They were not, the supernatural beings. They were humans like everybody else, but they had these inexplicable experiences. But they were tormented, and they knew they could not protect their children because it seemed to run in families. If a grandparent had been abducted, then the child of that parent, and then the grandchild. So for some reason, it seemed to go in, which no one understands, in families. But they all felt that if I was abducted, they told John Mack, then I can't protect my child from being abducted. So they really did, they suffered tremendously.
Late in the book, you refer to John Mack, you call him a hero. What do you mean by that?
Yes, I do find he was a hero, because I call him the believer in the book, the title of the book, and some people say, well, that's a pejorative description of someone who's too gullible. But I say, I find he was a believer in that he believed in social reform, social progress. He believed in benign consciousness in the universe. He believed in courage and confronting. He could have walked away, by the way. He could have, seen these people, heard about the experience and said, I'm not going to touch this one. This will hurt my career. That probably would have been a wise career move, but he wouldn't have been John Mack. So he had that courage, and he broke boundaries. He believed in breaking boundaries. So in the end, I compare him to, one of Joseph Campbell's mythical heroes who receives a call to adventure, rejects it, tries not to be picked, like Jonah, when God picks him for, he's, I don't want to go. And then reluctantly he goes, he has all these adventures, his life is risked, he comes through, and he comes back with a message or a gift for mankind, which is his research. So I say, yes, he was a hero. As a matter of fact, I use the occasion at the end of my book to congratulate us human beings, the human species, because we get a bad rap, in all the stories with the aliens, that they, literally run circles around us in the air. They fly around Navy jets. They subject people to these tormenting experiences that people have no control over. They can be abducted anytime, anywhere. And yet it's the human beings like John Mack who are investigating this. And that's the best of our species, the way I like to say it. So yes, I call John Mack a hero.
Even though this is not a new field for you, you did uh, important reporting for the New York Times about UFOs years ago. Uh, Getting involved with him and his story and spending all the years that you did putting this book together, has it changed you, do you think?
Well, I became, look, I didn't know anything about this business. I picked up John Mack's second book when I was a correspondent in Texas in 2004. And I was amazed that a Harvard psychiatrist would be writing about it. That second book was a bit toned down from the first, but it was still amazing. And I thought I'd give him a call and interview him. I didn't know how famous he already was. And I was kind of naive. And then I picked up the paper one day and he'd been run down in London by a drunk driver. Not assassinated as the rumors went. He'd just been, it was an unfortunate accident. And so that got me started on, I said, I want to learn more about him. I contacted the family. I got access to his journals and private papers and archives. So that got me started, but I didn't start off particularly interested in UFOs or aliens, but I was gripped, the way he was.
It's a provocative, to say the least, book, The Believer. Alien Encounters, Hard Science, The Passion of John Mack by Ralph Blumenthal. Ralph, it's a delight to talk to you about it. Good luck with the book, and come back and see us with the next one.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you again.